So I think on the email asking me to do this, I was asked to discuss where the EU should go next and how the EU can adapt and survive. And I've got to admit, this really threw me slightly, because to be honest, I'm not really convinced that the EU will go anywhere. Or at least I'm not really convinced, that is, that there's any kind of reform that would work sufficiently well, unless it brought around a kind of substantial change, pretty much. In which case it would not be the EU as we know it that persists, but some quite different kind of thing. Anyway, I'm not even really convinced that that kind of whole-scale substantial reform is ever going to happen anyway, or at least not until after total collapse, when anything might happen. So yes, to answer the question I set, I'm not really convinced that the EU can adapt and survive. I'm certainly not convinced it will or can change in a way that will become more conducive to respect for freedom, which of course this event is focused on. Basically, my money is on the EU's breakup, sooner or later. Simply, there probably just needs to be one big catastrophe, economic or otherwise, and it could easily collapse. An important member state or two just cannot cope, EU institutions fail and break down, uprisings take place, it's all over. That said, this is a little bit like predicting the fall of the Berlin Wall, or Brexit. We know it's coming, but it's hard to predict just when, or what will be the actual thing that will make it happen. Could be tomorrow, could be 10 years' time, probably somewhere in between. And while, of course, such an eventuality will undeniably bring a lot of pain to a lot of people, the breakup of the EU, I must admit, I don't see it happening as being an entirely bad thing. Yes, it will have many awful consequences, but a fear of awful consequences is not always a good reason in itself to want something you see as bad to persist. Now, I won't go through the reasons I think the EU is bad in detail, but suffice to say, I'm a big believer in democracy and sovereignty, and I also worry greatly about the way in which EU policies have severely harmed people within European countries, not least those countries with long-term structural economic problems which have been exacerbated by an ideological commitment to the euro. So yes, I think the EU as a formal structure in its current state will probably collapse. But because I'm not a determinist, I'd next like to think just very briefly about whether there is some form of change that might delay or, yes, even prevent this breakup. So when considering what might be necessary change here, I think two key points arise: technical or analytical predictions, and the need to respond to demand from people within member states. The first of these points relates to assessments about issues within states, like financial crises and unemployment, and also issues across the whole of the EU, like security threats from outside or whatever. The second of these points about change relates to growing frustrations within member states, shown through the political discontent we see right across the state of Europe, the continent of Europe, polling figures, and so on. And this second point should not be underestimated, as fans of the EU still seem astonishingly prone to do. In fact, I was just thinking earlier, I remember some polling from, I think it was 2017, by the Tony Blair Institute, which is hardly the home of Brexit, which showed, when asked which of the following views is closest to your own personal position on France's membership of the EU, less than 10% of French voters had answered, "I want to see us remain in the EU as it is today." And when the respective question was asked to Germans, just over 10% of them wanted to remain as it is today. Sounds like pretty serious dissatisfaction. Related to that, generally, there have been probably two standard schools of thought about the kinds of change the EU might need if it were to persist in some form, kinds of change that people within member states have called for. The first of these, and this is a general comment outside of any particular specific current context, relates to more EU, more increased centralised top-down political control. You can take, for instance, the kind of classic Piketty suggestion of mutualising EU debt, issuing Eurobonds so the ECB could support countries in extremis, that kind of thing. Reforming approach necessitating greater political union. Now, that kind of reform might well be welcomed by some economically weaker countries, Greece, for instance, but probably not so much by some people in Germany. Insight into a standard take on an alternative approach to reform, therefore, comes from Paul Lever's recent excellent book, Berlin Rules. He's a former UK ambassador to Germany, and he contends in his book that whatever form a political union might take, it does not mean for Germans raising money in Germany for the benefit of others. His conclusion is that the extended union that Germany wants is one in which a closer eye can be kept on other countries with an aim to persuading them to approach fiscal policy along the German lines, low debt, borrowing, deficits. So what can we take from these two approaches, and crucially, what might they mean for freedom, individual freedom, say, within the EU? First, the need to recognise that there is a genuine need and demand for change. Second, however, that something pretty big would need to happen to bring about that kind of consensus. And third, and I think crucially, that it's wrong to think that all of this is focused on economics. And this brings me to my final and most important point, because for me, democracy is a necessary condition of a good and legitimate political society. When enacted properly, we can argue all day about what that is, it entails that our right to political participation and other key political rights are upheld. And I think this is essential for us as autonomous creatures who are born free and equal. It's essential to the recognition of freedom within organised society, and crucially to this discussion, something that, not least for practical reasons, seems best enacted within a nation state. So to my mind, while the EU remains technocratic and actively anti-democratic, it cannot help but impede our freedom and the freedom of our European friends. I don't see the change that I would predict. I do not see the EU becoming more democratic anytime soon, or starting to respect or recognise democratic processes within its member states. Its aims are completely otherwise, and a lack of responsiveness is built into its structures and institutions. So regardless of any change that might come about, I have little hope for the EU as it stands, and particularly on any assessment related to freedom. Thank you.